What happens when a warrior loses everything? Not just his strength, but his very purpose. Jack, a once powerful Pitbull, spent his life fighting to survive, only to have his world stolen by darkness. Blinded and broken, he was ready to give up. But then, something unexpected happened. This is more than just a story. It's a powerful lesson in trust, resilience, and the kind of love that can heal even the deepest wounds. Watch until the end, because what unfolds next will leave you speechless. Welcome to Vale Marks, where every story holds a meaning far beyond what meets the eye. Jack had been a warrior, but not in a battle of honor or valor. His fights had never been for justice or protection. Instead, they had been for survival, fought in the blood-stained pits of an underground dogfighting ring where only the strongest, the most ruthless, lived to see another day. He had never known kindness, only the harsh bite of a chain, the sting of wounds that were never allowed to heal, and the deafening roar of an audience that treated his suffering as entertainment. His world had been small, a dark, cramped cage that reeked of sweat and fear, the metallic tang of blood lingering in the air. There had been no soft voices, no gentle hands, only commands barked in cold, detached tones. Fight, win, or be discarded. Jack had fought because he had no choice. He had fought because pain was all he knew. The scars on his body were a map of battles won and lost, but the deepest wounds were the ones carved into his soul. Then one night, everything changed. The raid happened quickly, but to Jack, it was chaos. The sudden blare of sirens, the sound of heavy boots pounding against the concrete, the shouts of men whose voices carried an authority he didn't understand. His cage door was ripped open, but he didn't move, didn't dare. He had seen what happened to the dogs that defied their masters. He had learned that hesitation could mean death. But then, something unexpected. A pair of hands, rough but not cruel, reached for him. A voice, calm but firm. "Easy, buddy. You're okay now." Jack didn't believe it. He was loaded into a van with other dogs, some broken beyond repair, some so terrified they could do nothing but tremble. Jack didn't tremble. He just sat, rigid, his mind racing, his body coiled, waiting for the next command, the next blow, the next fight. But no one hit him. No one shouted. For the first time, there was silence. They took him to a shelter, a place with too many sounds, too many smells, too many unfamiliar things that set his instincts on edge. He was placed in a kennel, larger than the cage he had known, but still confining. And people came, people who looked at him with something he didn't understand. Pity, fear, hesitation. No one wanted him. He heard the whispers. Too dangerous. Too unpredictable. A fighting dog like that? He'll never adjust. Jack didn't know what adjusting meant. He only knew that the longer he sat in that shelter, the more his world shrank again. Then one day they arrived. Eleanor and James Parker were not young. Their steps were slower, their hair silvered by time, their faces lined with the weight of a life well lived. They walked past the younger dogs, the friendly ones who wagged their tails eagerly, pressing against their kennel doors. But they stopped in front of Jack. He sat, unmoving, watching them with dark, wary eyes. He had seen people like them before, the ones who hesitated, who second-guessed. They never stayed long. Eleanor knelt, pressing a palm against the chain-link fence. Her gaze was steady, not fearful, not pitying. "He's tired," she said softly, and Jack's ears flicked at the sound of her voice. James nodded. "Yeah, but he's still got fight in him." Jack didn't move when they opened the kennel. He expected them to drag him out to yank at his collar. Instead, they waited. And for reasons he couldn't explain, Jack stood. They took him home that day. Home, a word he had never understood. The Parker house was small, warm, filled with the scent of old wood and something sweet Eleanor liked to bake in the afternoons. Jack didn't trust it. He paced, his muscles coiled, waiting for the cage door to slam shut, for the voices to turn sharp. But it never happened. Eleanor was patient. She moved slowly, letting him come to her, offering gentle touches, but never forcing them. James spoke to him like he was something more than just muscle and scars. And one evening, something strange happened. Jack was lying on the floor near the fireplace, staring at the flickering light, his ears tuned to every creak of the house, every distant sound beyond the walls. Then Eleanor knelt beside him. She reached out, her hand resting against the top of his head. Jack stiffened, waiting for the forceful grip, the pull that always preceded something painful. But Eleanor's hand was soft. It didn't command. It simply rested there, warm and steady. For the first time in his life, touch did not mean pain. It was a revelation. In the weeks that followed, Jack learned things he had never been taught. He learned that food came without the expectation of a fight, that doors were open, not locked, that voices could be kind, and most shocking of all, he learned his name, Jack. Not a number, not a curse, not a growl of a command, just a name spoken with warmth. Little by little, something inside him changed. The tension in his body lessened. The need to constantly be on guard faded. He still flinched sometimes when James reached for him too quickly, still had nights where his dreams dragged him back to the ring, but he was healing. For the first time, Jack felt like he belonged. But then, the world shifted again. It started slowly, a hesitation before stepping off the porch, a moment where the shadows seemed deeper, where the light didn't stretch as far as it should. Jack ignored it at first, relying on his instincts, his memory of the house and the yard. Then came the stumbles, a misstep on the stairs, a hesitation before leaping onto the couch. One evening, Eleanor called him for dinner, and Jack, who had always known her voice, who had always found her without fail, walked in the wrong direction. He froze, confused, his ears twitching as he tried to correct himself. Eleanor's brow furrowed. Jack? The moment passed, but it left a weight in the air. A week later, he misjudged the distance between the porch and the grass, landing hard enough that he let out a startled yelp. James hurried to him, worry in his eyes, but Jack pulled away. And then one morning, he woke to darkness. Not the kind that came with night, not the kind that lifted with the morning sun. This was something else, something permanent. Jack blinked, turned his head, ears swiveling as he tried to make sense of the void surrounding him. But there was nothing. The warrior who had fought his whole life, who had survived everything thrown at him, had lost the one thing he had always relied on, his sight. And with it, he felt the last piece of himself slip away. At first, it was subtle. Jack didn't notice it immediately. Just small moments, barely perceptible shifts in his world. The sunlight didn't seem as sharp as it once had. The outlines of the furniture blurred at the edges. Sometimes he misjudged the distance between the couch and the floor, landing harder than expected. He shook it off. He was strong. He had spent his entire life relying on his instincts, on the sharp awareness that had kept him alive in a world that had never been kind. If something felt different, he would adjust. He always did. But then, it got worse. The kitchen table, the one that had stood in the same place since the day Eleanor and James brought him home, suddenly became an obstacle he couldn't predict. He walked straight into it, the sharp edge of the wood pressing against his shoulder. Jack froze, stunned, shaking his head in confusion. He had never miscalculated like that before. Eleanor noticed before he did. She saw the way he hesitated before stepping off the porch, how his ears flicked when he walked into a room, as if trying to listen for his surroundings instead of seeing them. And then, one evening, she watched as he bumped into the coffee table and stumbled, shaking his head in frustration. "Jack?" she called softly, her voice filled with something that made his stomach twist. Concern. Jack hated that sound. He tried to prove her wrong. He still raced to the door when James came home, still found his way to his bed by the fireplace, still followed Eleanor's voice when she called him for dinner. But something was different. One afternoon, as he waited for his meal, the smell of warm chicken filled his nose, and he knew exactly where to go. He stepped forward confidently, but his paw struck the water bowl first. It tipped, spilling across the floor with a sharp clang of metal. Jack flinched. He hadn't seen it. Eleanor rushed over, crouching beside him, her hands gentle as they touched his fur. "It's okay, sweetheart. It's just water. No harm done." But it wasn't okay. It wasn't just water. It was a sign. The world he had always known was slipping away from him, piece by piece, vanishing into a darkness that grew deeper every day. The next time it happened, it was worse. Jack had always known Eleanor's voice. He had memorized its every inflection, the way it carried warmth and familiarity. He had always been able to find her, no matter where she stood. But that morning, when she called his name, he turned in the wrong direction. He realized his mistake immediately, his ears flattening, his body stiffening, as if someone had struck him. He corrected himself quickly, moving toward her, trying to act as if nothing had happened. But Eleanor had seen it. She didn't say anything. She didn't have to. The next few weeks were a battle Jack had no idea how to fight. His once effortless movements became tentative, hesitant. He relied on memory, on counting steps, on listening to the rhythm of the house, the sound of Eleanor humming in the kitchen, the creak of James's chair in the living room. But it wasn't enough. One day he tried to jump onto the couch, a spot he had claimed as his own since the day he arrived. He had done it 1,000 times before, but this time he miscalculated. His paws missed the cushion, his body colliding with the armrest before he tumbled to the floor. Pain flared up his side. His breath came fast and shallow as he lay there, stunned, disoriented. James was there in an instant. "Easy, buddy. I got you." Jack pushed himself up quickly, shaking off the pain, his tail lowering in embarrassment. He didn't need help. He wasn't weak. But the worst moment came when he tried to go outside alone. It had been a warm afternoon, the kind where the scent of fresh grass lingered in the air. The back door had creaked open, and Jack had caught the familiar smell of autumn drifting toward him. For a second, he had felt like himself again. He had always loved the backyard. It was his territory. He knew every inch of it, the old oak tree that stood tall at the edge, the small dip in the ground near the flower beds where he liked to lie down, the wooden fence that kept him safe. But today, the wind shifted, and suddenly, nothing felt familiar. Jack took a step forward, his nose lifting, searching for something recognizable. But the scents swirled unpredictably, blending together in a way that made his stomach tighten. The world no longer had clear boundaries. He tried to listen, tried to hear the rustling of the leaves, the distant hum of a car passing by. But everything sounded too far, too close, too different. His breath quickened. His muscles locked. He took another step. Too fast, too unsure. His paw landed on uneven ground, and before he could stop himself, he stumbled. His legs gave out beneath him, and he collapsed onto the dirt. The impact wasn't hard, but it wasn't the fall that hurt him. It was the realization. He lay there, his chest rising and falling with ragged breaths. His body trembled, not from pain, but from something worse. Defeat. Jack had spent his entire life fighting for survival, fighting to be strong, and now he couldn't even find his way back home. The backyard, the place that had once been his kingdom, had become an endless, uncharted abyss, and he was lost. A soft cry left his throat before he could stop it, a low, broken whimper that he barely recognized as his own. Then, warmth. A gentle hand against his face, soft fingers brushing through his fur. "Oh, sweetheart," Eleanor whispered, kneeling beside him. "It's okay. I've got you." Jack stiffened. He hated the way she said it. So careful. So kind. He didn't want kindness. He wanted strength. But when he tried to stand, his legs wobbled beneath him. The world spun in a way it never had before. Eleanor didn't force him. She just stayed there, her presence steady, waiting. And after a long moment, Jack let out a slow, shaky breath. He leaned into her touch. Just a little. Just enough to know he wasn't alone. Eleanor sat at the kitchen table, staring at the steaming cup of tea between her hands, though she had no intention of drinking it. Across the room, Jack lay curled up near the fireplace, his body still, his breathing steady but distant. He was there, but he wasn't really there. It had been weeks since he stopped trying. At first, he had fought against his blindness, resisting the inevitable. Then came the frustration, the confusion, the fear. And now, there was nothing. Jack no longer greeted James at the door. He no longer perked up at the rustling of leaves outside. He didn't even lift his head when Eleanor called his name. He just existed, trapped in a world that had closed its doors on him. Eleanor's heart ached. Jack had been a survivor, a fighter. She had seen the resilience in him from the moment they brought him home. And now, that fire, the thing that had kept him going through every hardship, was gone. She couldn't stand to watch it happen. So the next morning, she did something she had never considered before. She drove to the local rescue center. The air was thick with the scent of disinfectant and the faint musk of fur as she stepped inside. The familiar sound of barking echoed down the halls, some enthusiastic, some anxious, all longing for attention. She had been here before, years ago, when she and James had first adopted Jack. Back then, she had been filled with excitement, hopeful about bringing home a new companion. But today was different. She wasn't looking for a pet. She was looking for a miracle. A young woman in a blue shelter uniform approached her, smiling warmly. "Can I help you find someone?" Eleanor hesitated, not sure how to explain. "I have a dog. Jack. He's struggling. He lost his sight, and now I think he's losing himself, too." Her voice caught in her throat, but she steadied herself. "I was hoping to find him a friend. Someone who might help him remember who he is." The woman, Sarah, according to her name tag, studied Eleanor for a long moment, her eyes filled with quiet understanding. "I think I might have just the one," she said softly. Eleanor followed her down a hallway lined with kennels. She passed dogs of all kinds, some wagging their tails eagerly, others watching her with cautious eyes. But Sarah didn't stop for any of them. Instead, she led Eleanor to the very last kennel. Inside, a golden retriever lay stretched out on the floor, his head resting on his paws. His golden fur had lost some of its luster, and his body, though still strong, held an air of exhaustion. He didn't move when they approached. "This is Cooper," Sarah said gently. Eleanor frowned. He wasn't like the other dogs. He didn't press against the bars, didn't wag his tail in hopeful excitement. He didn't even look at her. "He used to be a rescue dog," Sarah explained. "One of the best. He worked in search and rescue, trained to find people after disasters. He saved lives, a lot of them." Eleanor felt a tug at her heart. "What happened?" Sarah hesitated before answering. "His last mission was during a hurricane. A little girl had gone missing in the flood. Cooper tracked her through the wreckage, through the water, through everything, until he finally found her." Eleanor's chest tightened. But it was too late." The words hung in the air like a weight. "Cooper wouldn't leave her," Sarah continued, her voice quieter now. "The rescue team had to pull him away. He fought them. He didn't understand why they were stopping him. He didn't understand that there was nothing more he could do." Eleanor swallowed the lump in her throat. "After that, he changed," Sarah said. "He stopped responding to training, stopped searching, stopped running. It was like He lost his purpose. Eleanor looked back at Cooper, her heart breaking for him. He was breathing, he was alive, but he wasn't really living. She knew that feeling. She had seen it before. She had seen it in Jack. Two souls, both broken by a world that had once relied on their strength but had left them behind when they were no longer needed. Two warriors, lost in the silence of their own pain. Could one broken heart heal another? Eleanor stepped closer to the kennel, crouching down. "Hey there, Cooper," she murmured. For the first time, the golden retriever lifted his head. His deep brown eyes met hers, filled with something Eleanor couldn't quite name. Not hope, not excitement, but maybe a question. Maybe the same question she had been asking herself. Was it too late to be saved? She reached a hand toward the bars, leaving it there, open, an invitation. Cooper hesitated. Then, slowly, carefully, he lifted his head just a little more. And after a long, silent moment, he moved. Just enough to press his nose lightly against her fingers. Eleanor exhaled, her heart clenching. No, she thought. It wasn't too late at all. The first time Cooper stepped into the Parker house, he did so quietly, cautiously, his golden fur catching the warm glow of the afternoon sun filtering through the windows. His ears flicked at the creak of the wooden floor beneath his paws, but he made no sudden moves. He was no stranger to new places, but this was different. This wasn't just another assignment. This was supposed to be home. Across the room, Jack lay curled on his bed by the fireplace, unmoving. His ears twitched at the faint sounds of Cooper's approach, but he didn't lift his head. He didn't acknowledge the newcomer at all. Cooper paused, tilting his head slightly, studying the Pitbull with quiet curiosity. He had met many dogs in his life, nervous ones, eager ones, aggressive ones, but Jack was something else. Jack was still. Too still. Eleanor placed a gentle hand on Cooper's head. "Give him time," she whispered. Time. Cooper knew all about time. He knew what it meant to wait, to hope, to wonder if things would ever feel normal again. He had been waiting for something. He just wasn't sure what. So he waited for Jack. For the first few days, he did not push, did not demand. He simply existed in Jack's space without asking for anything in return. He lay nearby, but never too close. When Eleanor sat on the couch, Cooper rested at her feet, stealing quiet glances at Jack, who never once met his gaze. Jack wasn't aggressive. He wasn't hostile. He simply acted as if Cooper didn't exist. And Cooper understood. Jack's world had been stripped away from him, leaving him stranded in darkness, alone in a way that no amount of companionship could immediately fix. He had spent his life fighting his own battles, relying on his strength, his instincts. And now, without them, he was lost. Cooper had been lost before, too. On the third day, something shifted. Jack stood at the back door, his nose twitching as he tried to map out his surroundings. Eleanor had left the door open, hoping, just hoping, he might step outside. But Jack hesitated. The porch had always been familiar, safe. But now it felt like the edge of a cliff, a threshold between the known and the unknown. His paws flexed against the wooden floor, his body rigid with uncertainty. Then Cooper moved. Not toward Jack, not to push him forward, but past him. He stepped outside first, padding down onto the cool grass, then stopped. He turned his head, and he waited. Jack's ears twitched. He knew Cooper was there, could hear his steady breathing, the soft rustle of fur shifting with the breeze. Cooper didn't bark. He didn't whine. He didn't try to coax Jack out. He simply stood. Jack hesitated for another long moment. Then, with a slow exhale, he lifted one paw and placed it forward. The wood was solid beneath him, familiar, safe. Another step, then another, and then he felt the cool touch of grass beneath his paws. Jack let out a quiet breath. Cooper didn't move. Jack didn't acknowledge him, didn't show any sign of gratitude, but he didn't need to. Cooper understood. This was a start. That night, as the house settled into quiet, Jack lay in his usual spot by the fireplace. Cooper, as always, was nearby. Then, somewhere in the distance, a sharp noise cracked through the silence, a car door slamming shut. Jack tensed, his ears perking, his muscles coiling instinctively. He didn't know where the sound had come from, couldn't place it in the vast emptiness of his world. Panic coiled tight in his chest. Then, a sound, a single soft bark. Cooper. Jack turned his head slightly, his ears catching the low, steady tone of Cooper's voice. It wasn't a warning, it wasn't alarm, it was reassurance. Jack didn't relax immediately. His body remained tense, his breath still uneven, but he didn't panic. Cooper had given him an answer before he even needed to ask. It's okay. Jack let out a slow breath, his muscles easing slightly. He still didn't trust the world. But maybe, just maybe, he could trust Cooper. Not yet. Not fully. But someday. The night was colder than usual, the wind slicing through the trees like a whispered warning. The Parker house sat still, its warm glow barely touching the darkness stretching beyond the yard. Inside, Cooper slept peacefully by the fireplace, his breaths slow and even. Jack lay nearby, though sleep never came easily to him anymore. The night felt different. The air carried something he couldn't quite name, a shift, a pull, something calling to him. And then the back door creaked open. The wind had loosened the latch earlier that day, nudging it just enough for it to drift ajar. Jack's ears twitched at the sound, his nose flaring as a gust of cold air brought the scent of the outside world rushing in. The familiar scent of grass, of soil dampened by evening dew, mixed with something else. Something untamed. Wild. For the first time in a long time, Jack moved without thinking. He rose to his feet, stepping toward the door, his paws barely making a sound against the wooden floor. The scent outside was tempting, pulling at some deep, instinctual part of him. He hesitated at the threshold, his ears swiveling. He couldn't see what lay beyond, but he knew it was there. Freedom. For so long, the darkness had been a prison, the walls of the house a cage he hadn't dared to leave without Cooper by his side. But tonight, something was different. The door was open. The night was calling, and Jack answered. He stepped forward, paws sinking into the cool earth, his breath steady but cautious. The wind shifted, carrying unfamiliar scents, musk, fur, something primal. He froze, his instincts sharpening, though his eyes gave him nothing. Then the growl came. Low, deep, not from one voice but many. Jack's muscles tensed as he turned his head, his ears straining. He knew that sound. It wasn't curiosity. It wasn't a warning bark from a house dog defending its yard. It was hunger. A second growl rumbled through the night, followed by the soft shuffle of paws against dirt. Jack's breath hitched. His body knew what to do. He had fought before, had survived in places where only the strong lived. But this was different. He couldn't see them. Couldn't gauge their movements, couldn't fight like he used to. Panic clawed at his chest as he backed up, his paws slipping slightly on the uneven ground. The darkness was suffocating, swallowing him whole. He turned his head, listening, waiting for a sound, any sound, to tell him where they were. A sharp bark cut through the silence, then another. Jack's breath came in sharp, uneven bursts. They were closing in. He braced himself, his body stiffening, every muscle coiled tight. His mind screamed at him to fight, to stand his ground. But how? He couldn't see their movements, couldn't anticipate their attacks. He was trapped, alone. And then, a blur of movement, a rush of wind. A second later, a familiar sound split the night. Cooper. His bark rang out, sharp, commanding. Jack didn't need to see him to know he was there. He could hear the urgency in his voice, could feel the shift in the air as Cooper moved. The dogs hesitated. Cooper barked again, but this time it wasn't an act of aggression. It was something else, something calculated. Jack heard the sudden rush of paws, the scramble of movement. Not toward him. Away. Cooper was running, leading them. Jack's ears twitched, tracking the sound. Cooper was drawing them out, luring them away. It wasn't an attack. It was strategy. Minutes passed, long, agonizing minutes where Jack stood frozen, listening, waiting. The night stretched on, the silence unbearable. Then footsteps, lighter, familiar. Cooper. Jack turned his head sharply as he felt a soft nudge against his shoulder. Warm, steady, grounding. Cooper had come back for him. Jack exhaled a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. His legs trembled, exhaustion settling deep into his bones. He had spent his whole life believing strength was in the fight. That survival meant standing alone, teeth bared, ready to take on whatever came for him. But tonight, Cooper had shown him something different. Strength wasn't about fighting. Strength was knowing when to trust. Jack took a shaky step forward, then another, and this time, he didn't walk alone. The morning after the storm was quiet. The sky, once torn apart by wind and rain, had settled into a soft, overcast gray. The Parker house stood still, the remnants of fallen leaves scattered across the yard, the damp scent of earth lingering in the air. Inside, warmth radiated from the fireplace, flickering shadows dancing against the wooden floors. Jack lay curled in his usual spot, his breathing steady, his body sore, but at peace. The events of the previous night had left their mark. Not in bruises or wounds, but in something deeper, something that lingered in the silence between heartbeats. For the first time in his life, he hadn't fought. And yet, he had survived. Beside him, Cooper rested, his golden fur still damp from the rain, his chest rising and falling in a slow rhythm. Jack could feel the warmth of him, the quiet presence that had become as familiar as his own shadow. A soft creak of floorboards. Eleanor's footsteps approached, slow and careful. She knelt beside Jack, her hand resting gently on his head. "Morning, sweetheart," she whispered. Jack's ear flicked at the sound, but he didn't flinch away. There was no pity in her touch, no hesitation in her voice, only warmth, only love. He had spent so much of his life waiting for pain, expecting cruelty. But here, in this home, in this moment, there was none. And maybe, for the first time, he was ready to believe it. Later that afternoon, Eleanor stood by the back door, her hand resting on the knob. She hesitated for a moment before glancing over at Jack, who sat near the fireplace. The door had always been a threshold, a line he had been afraid to cross alone. Even when Cooper had waited outside, even when the world beyond the house had called to him, Jack had remained frozen in place, unwilling to step into the unknown. But today, something felt different. Eleanor slowly turned the handle and let the door swing open. A cool breeze drifted in, carrying with it the scent of wet grass, the distant chirp of birds. Jack lifted his head. Cooper, already standing by the doorway, turned slightly, his tail wagging just once. Jack hesitated for only a moment before pushing himself to his feet. His paws met the wooden floor, steady and sure. And then, without waiting, without fear, he walked forward. His first step onto the porch was solid. His second was smoother. By the third, he had found his rhythm. Jack didn't pause. He didn't hesitate. He walked straight into the yard. Eleanor held her breath, watching as Jack moved. Slow but sure, each step deliberate, purposeful. He couldn't see where he was going, but that didn't matter anymore, because he wasn't alone. Cooper walked beside him, close enough that their shoulders nearly brushed, but not so close that he led. He didn't need to. Jack already knew the way. The backyard, once a vast and terrifying abyss, now felt different beneath his paws. He could hear the rustling of leaves, could feel the cool earth beneath him, could smell the damp wood of the fence that lined the perimeter. Everything was the same, but he was different. Cooper suddenly stopped, and Jack felt it. His presence, the subtle shift in the air beside him. Then, without warning, Cooper nudged him, his wet nose pressing lightly against Jack's ear. It was a playful gesture, nothing more than a quiet acknowledgement. Jack tensed for a fraction of a second, his body remembering old habits, the instinct to pull away, to snap in warning. But then, he exhaled. And he didn't growl, didn't bristle, didn't retreat. He simply stood there, breathing, feeling the warmth of his friend beside him. Then, as if the moment had been too much, too deep, Cooper huffed, stepping away with a flick of his tail. He lowered his front legs into a bow, his tail wagging just enough to send a clear message, a challenge. Jack's head tilted slightly. Cooper barked, a short, encouraging sound. For a brief second, Jack remained still. Then, he took a step forward, and another. And before he knew it, he was moving faster, his paws picking up speed, his body light in a way it hadn't felt in a long time. Cooper ran ahead, but only slightly, letting Jack find his own pace. He barked again, his tail wagging in wide, sweeping arcs. Jack couldn't see the way the wind caught Cooper's fur, the way the golden strands gleamed in the soft light. He couldn't see the way the world stretched open before them, endless and free, but he could feel it. And for the first time since the darkness took him, it didn't feel like a prison. It felt like possibility. Jack slowed, his breaths coming quick but even. His muscles ached, but it was the kind of ache that came from movement, from effort, not from fear. Cooper trotted back toward him, his tongue lolling from the side of his mouth, his entire body radiating contentment. Jack stood still for a moment, his ears flicking as he took in the sounds around him, the wind in the trees, the distant laughter of children from a neighboring house, the rhythmic thump of Cooper's tail against the ground. Then, without thinking, without planning, he moved closer. And this time, when his body brushed against Cooper's side, he didn't pull away. He leaned in. Eleanor stood on the porch, her hands clasped tightly in front of her, tears pricking her eyes. She had spent weeks worrying, wondering if Jack would ever come back to them, if he would ever find himself again. And now, watching him there, standing tall, standing free, she knew. He had found something greater than sight. He had found his light, not through his eyes, but through trust, through friendship, through love. Jack had spent his life believing that strength was in solitude, that to survive, he had to stand alone. But Cooper had taught him something different. Strength wasn't about fighting. Strength was about knowing when to let someone stand beside you. And as Jack turned his head slightly, feeling the warmth of his friend beside him, he knew one thing for certain. The darkness no longer scared him. Not anymore. The years passed gently, like the turning of pages in a well-loved book. Seasons came and went, and through it all, Jack remained at Eleanor and James's side. His fur, once thick and strong, grew speckled with gray. His steps, once powerful and steady, became slower, more deliberate. Yet through every change, one thing remained the same: Cooper. The golden retriever never left Jack's side. He had been there in the darkness, when Jack had feared the world had nothing left for him, and he remained there, even as the years softened the edges of their days together. They moved as one, two halves of a whole, bound by something deeper than companionship. Jack had learned to navigate the world in ways he never imagined. He no longer needed his sight. He had Cooper, and Cooper had him. Where one went, the other followed. They shared the backyard, the porch, the space by the fireplace. And in the moments when Jack paused, listening to the world beyond his reach, Cooper was always there, his presence as constant as the rising sun. But time is unrelenting. One evening, as autumn leaves painted the Parker yard in hues of gold and rust, Jack settled onto his cushion by the fire, his body curling into the warmth he had always found there. His breaths were slow, deep, steady. Cooper lay beside him, his head resting gently against Jack's shoulder. The house was quiet, wrapped in the familiar embrace of peace, and then, sometime in the quiet hours before dawn, Jack exhaled one final, contented breath. And he did not take another. The world did not stop. The wind continued to whisper through the trees, the morning light stretched gently across the wooden floor. But for Cooper, something had shifted. He lifted his head, nudging Jack softly, expecting the familiar response. A quiet huff, the slow wag of a tail. But there was nothing. The silence pressed against him, heavy and unyielding. And then a sound, low at first, trembling at the edges. A howl. It rose into the stillness, deep and aching, a sound that carried with it the weight of years spent together. A call not to summon, but to mourn. Eleanor woke to the sound, her heart breaking before her mind could even fully understand. She hurried to the living room, her hands shaking as she reached for Cooper, whispering his name. But he didn't move. He sat beside Jack, his golden fur illuminated by the first rays of morning, his eyes filled with something more than sorrow, something like gratitude. Jack was gone. But he had not left alone. The days that followed felt quieter, emptier. Jack's absence lingered in the spaces where he had once been, in the empty cushion by the fireplace, in the backyard where he had once found his freedom. Cooper searched for him at first, his ears perking at every familiar sound, his head turning at every whisper of wind that felt like a memory. But deep down, he knew. Jack wasn't lost. He had simply moved on. And yet time, as it always does, continued. Months passed, then a year. Cooper, though older now, still carried himself with the same steady presence. He walked beside Eleanor through the house, rested at James's feet in the afternoons. But something was missing. He had spent years guiding Jack, showing him the way, being the light when the darkness had taken everything else. And now, for the first time in a long time, he didn't have someone to lead. Then one morning, everything changed. Eleanor stood in the doorway, her hands wrapped around a small bundle of fur. The puppy was tiny, trembling slightly in her grasp. His ears twitched at the sounds around him, his nose sniffing cautiously at the air. His eyes, clouded and unseeing, blinked, though they saw nothing. A blind Pitbull pup. Cooper, who had been resting by the fireplace, lifted his head. His golden eyes studied the small creature in Eleanor's arms. She knelt down, setting the puppy gently on the floor. "His name is Theo," she said softly. Theo hesitated, his tiny paws barely shifting against the wooden floor. He was afraid. Cooper knew that fear. He had seen it before. He had waited for it to pass, had stood beside it until it no longer had power. Without hesitation, he stood up. He took a slow step forward, his paws barely making a sound. Theo's ears flicked at the movement, his nose twitching, sensing the presence before him. He didn't move, so Cooper did. He stepped past Theo just far enough to create space, then turned his head. And he waited. Eleanor held her breath. For a long moment, Theo didn't move. His body remained tense, uncertain. The world was vast, unfamiliar, full of unknowns. But then, a single hesitant step, then another. Cooper's tail wagged just once. Theo stopped beside him, his small body trembling slightly. Cooper didn't push, didn't force. He simply let Theo feel his presence, and then, very softly, he reached out, his nose brushing against Theo's ear. A quiet moment, a quiet connection. The circle had begun again. Eleanor wiped a tear from her cheek as she watched. She had wondered if Cooper would ever find his way after losing Jack. But now, as she looked at them, one young, one old, one just beginning, one guiding. She knew. Jack had needed Cooper once. Now Theo needed him, too. A few months later, the town gathered at the park, the crisp autumn air swirling around them. At the center of the gathering stood a statue, freshly unveiled. Two figures cast in bronze stood side by side. One, a proud Pitbull, his head lifted high despite the darkness he had endured. The other, a golden retriever, standing beside him, not leading, not following, but together. At the base of the statue, an inscription had been carved into stone. Strength isn't about fighting. It's about knowing who to trust. Eleanor traced her fingers over the words, her heart swelling with emotion. Jack had fought so many battles in his lifetime, but the greatest victory he had ever won had not been in a fight. It had been in learning to trust. And as Cooper and Theo stood beneath the statue, one waiting, one learning, Eleanor knew one thing for certain. The story wasn't over. It had only just begun again. Life has a way of teaching us that strength isn't just about the battles we fight. It's about knowing who we can lean on when we no longer have the power to stand alone. Jack thought his world had ended, but in truth, it had only just begun. His journey with Cooper wasn't just about survival. It was about discovering that true strength lies in trust, in friendship, and in the courage to walk forward, even when the path is unknown. If this story touched your heart, let us know in the comments. Have you ever witnessed an act of pure, unconditional love, one that changed everything? Your words inspire us to continue bringing meaningful stories to life. Make sure to subscribe to Veil Marks and turn on notifications. Every story we share is a reminder that even in our darkest moments, there is always light to be found. Let's grow this community together. 1,000 voices strong, each one carrying a lesson worth telling. Because sometimes the most powerful stories aren't just the ones we hear, they're the ones we share.